I wasn't expecting a message from the platform that night. I had just poured myself a glass of red and was settling into the quiet of my living room, the cabin lights humming softly behind me. The email subject line was innocuous enough. "Thanks for hosting. Here's your latest guest review." At first I thought it was spam. I hadn't hosted anyone in months. I clicked it anyway. The review was glowing. 5 stars. A guest named Thomas R. complimented the view from the deck, the interior decor, the easy check-in. He even mentioned how responsive the host was when the hot water hiccuped. I blinked at the screen. There was no hot water issue the last time I stayed at the cabin. I would have known. I designed that place down to the grout color in the guest bathroom. I opened my hosting dashboard. It took a minute to load over the cabin's spotty rural Wi-Fi, but when it did, a chill ran down my spine. 9 completed stays, $28,400 earned. The payout account, not mine. The host name? Fallon West. Not Fallon, Fallon. I stared at the misspelled version of my own name, the listing photos clearly taken without my knowledge, the title, Scenic Ridge Cabin Escape with Fireplace and Forest View. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear myself think. Someone had turned my private retreat into a business. Someone who knew enough about me, my property, my routines to do it smoothly. Someone close enough to use my photos, my details, and get away with it for 5 months. There was only one person who fit that profile. Iris. I stood up too fast. The wine sloshed over the rim of the glass and stained the white throw blanket draped over my chair. I didn't care. I walked straight to the kitchen, grabbed my phone, and called Brandon. Brandon had been the one helping me maintain the cabin. He was local, meticulous, and didn't ask many questions. I trusted him. I asked if he'd seen anyone at the property lately. He hesitated. "Actually, yeah," he said slowly. "There's been people up there almost every weekend since January. At first I figured you gave someone permission, but then I saw a white Tahoe pull up 3 Saturdays in a row, same driver, same time. I figured I should mention it, but I didn't want to step on any family business." Family business. That's what it always came down to. I thanked him quietly and hung up. My hands were cold, even though the room wasn't. The last time I let Iris use the cabin was during the holidays. She had asked for a quiet place to decompress with the kids, and I had agreed, despite the tension between us. I gave her the keypad code, asked her to lock up and reset everything when she left. I never imagined she'd keep the code, let alone change it. I opened the security app on my phone. The camera feed was offline. All of it. Front porch, living room, hallway. No signal. They had disabled them. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I sat in bed with my laptop on my knees, screenshotting every transaction, every review, every detail on the fake listing. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was organized, intentional, profitable. And it had all happened while I stayed quiet, while I gave people the benefit of the doubt. By morning, I had packed a weekend bag, printed all the documents, and booked a one-night stay at a nearby lodge. Then I drove 5 hours north, up the winding mountain roads toward Coyfield Ridge, my cabin. When I arrived, there was a silver SUV parked in the gravel driveway. Ken's car, Iris's husband. The gate latch was clipped open with a chain link dangling. I parked at a distance and walked slowly, phone ready in one hand, pepper spray in the other. The back door was ajar. I could hear movement inside, vacuum cleaner hum, the faint clink of glass. I stepped up to the doorway and stood in silence. Inside, Ken was on his knees, scrubbing something near the fireplace. On the couch lay an open iPad displaying booking info, check-in dates, pricing, a message thread with a potential guest named Laurie W. asking if dogs were allowed. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, he froze, then smiled. "Oh, hey," he said like I was interrupting him fixing a leaky faucet. "I didn't think you'd be back until summer." I didn't speak. I couldn't. The audacity of it was too much, too fresh. "You know," he added casually, wiping his hands on a towel, "Iris was going to tell you we were just keeping it afloat for now. You weren't using it." I backed away slowly and left. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I documented everything. The iPad, the logs, the broken gate, the new keypad installed above the old deadbolt. Then I drove away, heart hammering, not from fear, but from the slow brewing rage that comes when you realize someone you trusted has been stealing from you in plain sight. I knew what came next, and this time I wouldn't be asking for permission to act. I spent the next 2 days in a quiet lodge 5 miles from the cabin, watching the property through Brandon's newly installed backup trail camera. It wasn't the best angle, just a grainy wide shot from the tree line, but it was enough to catch what mattered: the comings and goings, the deliveries, the people treating my home like it belonged to them. A couple showed up on Friday evening with overnight bags and 2 dogs. Ken handed them a set of keys and laughed about the local wildlife. He pointed toward the firewood stack I had built with my own hands and told them, "Feel free to use as much as you like. It's part of the charm." Charm. I kept replaying that word in my head like it was a personal insult. On Sunday, I sent Iris a text. No punctuation, no hello, I know, we need to talk. She didn't respond until late evening. When she did, it was a voice note. "Fallon, I really wish you'd called me earlier instead of being dramatic. Ken and I were going to loop you in. We didn't know how to approach it. You've been so distant lately. Look, let's talk like family, okay? No need to overreact." Overreact. I nearly dropped my phone. The irony of it was so clean it almost made me laugh. They had stolen from me, rented out my home, collected over $28,000 in under 5 months, changed locks, disabled cameras, and her biggest concern was whether I was overreacting. I forwarded the voice note to my lawyer that night. Then I called Brandon and gave him permission to retrieve the guest log Ken had left lying on the counter. Brandon arrived with a photo the next day. It was a spiral notebook with lined pages and neat handwriting that wasn't Iris's. It wasn't Ken's either. On the inside cover was a note: "Welcome to Fallon's Ridge Retreat. Please leave a comment. Your feedback helps us grow." Beneath that were scribbled reviews from guests who had unknowingly supported a con. One wrote, "Best hidden gem in the mountains. Great hosts, amazing deck view. Will come back." Another, "Ken and Iris were fantastic. Felt like staying with friends." I stared at the photo for a long time. It felt like reading an obituary for my sense of safety. Every entry was another line etched into the wall between me and the people I once called family. I drove back to the city the next morning and walked straight into Charlotte Green's office. She was mid-sip of a green smoothie when she saw my face and immediately set it down. "You're ready?" she said. I nodded. "I want a cease and desist letter drafted by tomorrow. I want their access revoked, locks changed, and any digital footprint of their listing scrubbed." Charlotte gave a slight smile, the kind that said welcome to the fight. "I can file an emergency injunction," she said, "but be prepared. People like them don't go quietly." Iris didn't. Within hours of receiving the notice, she called me from a different number. I let it ring out. Then came the texts, emotional, accusatory, manipulative. "You're choosing a house over your own blood. Ken made a mistake. Why do you always punish everyone for being human? You could have just asked us to stop, but no, you had to make it legal." Legal. As if that was some sort of personal betrayal. That night Jared made dinner. I wasn't hungry, but I sat across from him anyway, watching the way he stirred sauce without looking up, like he was measuring every breath he took around me. "They think I won't go through with it," I said. He finally looked up. "Will you?" "Yes." He studied my face for a moment, then nodded and returned to the stove. No pep talk, no debate, just trust. Later that night he brought me his old iPad. "Look what I found," he said. "Their listing is still live under a pseudonym, same photos. They just changed the cabin name to Aspen Hollow Escape." I scrolled through the page, my stomach turning with every detail they'd copied. The blanket I'd brought from Italy, now labeled luxury imported throw. The bookshelf I built during lockdown, now described as curated for peace and reflection. Even the deck. They had angled the photos just so that you couldn't see the security camera they'd removed. I was done. The next day, Charlotte sent the takedown notices to the platform and filed the cease and desist with the county clerk. Meanwhile, Brandon changed all access points, installed an encrypted security system, and retrieved mail that had been forwarded without my consent. Among the items was a utilities bill sent to an account labeled F. West at the cabin's address. They had set up power and Wi-Fi in my name, used my identity, my credit, and my mother still hadn't said a word. When I called her, she sounded like she'd been waiting. "I heard," she said quietly. I didn't respond. "Iris told me everything. You're being very firm." Firm. It was like they'd agreed on the vocabulary. "She made a mistake," Mom added. "No," I said. "They made a choice, and then they doubled down. They didn't just use the cabin. They faked documents. They took over the utilities. They filed taxes under my name." There was silence. Then in that brittle voice only mothers seemed to wield, she said, "You've always been so independent. Maybe that's why you don't understand how desperate people can get. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. I understand desperation, Mom. What I don't understand is betrayal. I ended the call before she could answer. I didn't cry that night, but something in me felt like it had broken, not loudly, not violently, but with the same soft snap of a drawer being shut too hard one too many times. And I knew this wasn't about a cabin anymore. Some trespasses aren't just legal, they're personal. The letter arrived without a return address, folded inside a pastel pink envelope like it belonged to a birthday card. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Iris had always written like a Catholic schoolgirl, tight loops, sharp crosses on her T's, and an overly dramatic slant to the right, like even her letters refused to stand straight. I stood at the kitchen counter staring at it for a long time before sliding my nail under the flap. There was no apology, no admission, just 4 short paragraphs explaining how things got out of hand, how Ken was under pressure, and how they didn't think I'd mind since the cabin was just sitting there. The final sentence read like it had been recycled from 1,000 family therapy sessions. Fallon, it's not that we don't respect you, it's just that you've always made us feel like outsiders. Outsiders. I reread that word over and over until it started to lose shape, started to become something more like a reflection than an accusation. That night, I pulled out a faded shoebox from the back of my closet. Inside were old photos, stiff with age, family Christmases, birthdays, blurry road trips. Every one of them followed the same pattern, Iris in the center, me off to the side, always just outside the frame emotionally, even when I was in it physically. In one photo, I was holding a sheet cake at Iris's baby shower, smiling like I meant it. She was sitting in a wicker throne covered in blue ribbons, her hand resting dramatically on her belly, surrounded by friends from church and work. Our mother stood behind her, beaming. I was 13 when I first realized I was the wrong kind of daughter. I didn't play piano, I didn't wear pink, I didn't throw tantrums that made adults laugh and say I had spirit. I was quiet, observant, the kind of child who cleaned up without being asked and didn't make scenes in public. But instead of being praised, I was forgotten. I still remember standing in our hallway one summer, overhearing my mother on the phone with my aunt, her voice low but clear. Fallon, she's just not like Iris, not as warm. A bit hard to read sometimes, she keeps to herself. That was the moment I realized being easy to live with didn't make you easy to love. Back in the present, I sat on the floor of my living room with that letter in one hand and a framed photo in the other. It was the only picture I had from my college graduation. I was wearing a navy gown, standing alone on the edge of campus, while Iris and Mom were back home throwing a party for my nephew's 6th birthday. They hadn't come. Jared found me there an hour later, still sitting on the rug. He knelt beside me, touched the edge of the letter. Did she apologize? He asked. No, I said, folding the page with deliberate slowness. She explained. Explaining isn't the same as making it right. No, I repeated, it's not. The next morning, Charlotte called with updates. The hosting platform had finally taken down the duplicate listing. The forged documents Iris and Ken had filed under my name had been flagged for fraud. A police report was in motion, and she'd already drafted the civil suit paperwork, complete with a breakdown of financial damages. I need your decision on the emotional damages amount, Charlotte said. We can file for 10, maybe 15, depending on how far you want to go. I paused. Make it 20. There was a pause on her end. You sure? Yes, I said. I've earned it. Because it wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the accumulation of 1,000 unspoken moments, the unpaid emotional labor, the silence I'd carried like debt. That afternoon, my mother showed up. No call, no warning. Just the sudden sound of a knock on the front door, and the sight of her standing there in a beige cardigan, holding a plastic grocery bag filled with oranges and almond biscotti. I thought I'd drop by, she said, as if we did this all the time. I let her in, mostly because I didn't want a scene on the porch. She looked around my apartment like she was seeing it for the first time. It's quiet here, she murmured, placing the bag on the counter. I guess that suits you. I didn't respond. She sat down at the kitchen island, folding her hands like she was preparing for a confession. Iris told me you're suing, she said, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind me. I am. She's devastated. She's not. That landed like a slap, her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. You're not even willing to talk to her? She asked. I did, for years, in actions, in compromises, in letting her walk all over me. That was me talking. She just never listened. She looked down at her hands. I wish I'd been better at balancing things between the two of you. No, I said softly. You were very balanced. You made sure Iris never felt anything other than adored, and you made sure I never forgot that I had to earn everything. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. I loved you both, she whispered. No, I said again. You admired her. You tolerated me. She left 10 minutes later, the bag of oranges untouched. And I realized maybe the hardest part of reclaiming your life is grieving the people who are still alive, the ones who chose the illusion of family over the work of truly seeing you. Later that night, I sat at my desk and drafted a short letter for Charlotte to include in the civil filing. It read, "This is not about revenge, it's about accountability and boundaries and dignity, the kind I should never have had to fight this hard for. Sometimes silence isn't peace, it's pressure with a polite name." 3 days after the papers were filed, Iris showed up at my office. She didn't call ahead, didn't ask if I had time. She simply walked in past the front desk like she belonged there, wearing a blazer too crisp for someone who claimed she had nothing to hide. I stood when she entered, not out of respect, but because part of me still didn't believe she'd show her face after everything. "You've made your point," she said. Her tone wasn't humble, it was rehearsed. I didn't speak. "You think this makes you strong?" she asked. "Suing your own family? Dragging us through court like strangers?" "You made us strangers," I said. For a brief moment, something flickered in her face. Not remorse, calculation. Like she'd registered the shift in power and was working out how to spin it. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she continued. "It wasn't even that much money." I almost laughed. "You stole $28,000 from me. That's not borrowing. That's not a miscommunication. That's fraud." Ken stepped in then, hovering just behind her in the doorway like a shadow that didn't know where to land. He looked smaller than I remembered, like someone who'd banked on charm but ran out of collateral. "Look," he said, "we'll pay you back, every cent. We didn't think it'd go this far." "It went exactly as far as you pushed it," I replied. Iris set a folded piece of paper on my desk. "A check, 10,000. "And the rest?" I asked. Her silence was answer enough. "This isn't a down payment on forgiveness," I said, sliding the paper back toward her. "It's damage control, and it's too late." Her face twisted. Just slightly, the way it used to when she didn't get the final word in high school arguments. "So this is who you are now," she muttered. "Cold, legal, alone." "No," I said calmly. "This is who I've always been. You just didn't think I mattered enough to notice." They left without saying goodbye. I didn't watch them go. That night, Charlotte and I finalized the civil settlement terms: repayment in full, coverage for legal fees, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and a no-contact clause enforced by court order. Violation would trigger escalation to criminal charges. "I don't need an apology," I told her. "I need a record." Charlotte nodded. "That's not vindictive, that's smart." Later, Jared poured us each a glass of the same wine we opened the day I bought the cabin. I remember because the cork had broken, and we'd laughed about how even good things sometimes arrive flawed. "This isn't over," I said quietly. "No," he replied, "but you're not losing anymore." Outside the window, the city was humming like it always did: cars, streetlights, late-night conversations carried through brick walls. But inside, for the first time in weeks, I felt the stillness wasn't a silence waiting to break. It was mine. I didn't hear from Iris or Ken for nearly a week after they left my office. Silence, for most people, signals the end of a conflict. But with them, it was always a tactic, a kind of circling in the tall grass before deciding whether to pounce or retreat. I didn't relax, I just waited. On the 7th morning, Charlotte called. "They've responded to the terms," she said, voice clipped, "and unexpectedly, they're not challenging them." I sat up straighter. "All of it?" "Full repayment, legal fees, and the emotional distress damages. But there's a catch." Of course there was. "They want the agreement to include a clause that prohibits you from speaking publicly about what happened. Ever." I exhaled sharply, the kind of laugh that has no humor in it. "They're worried about their image." "They're terrified of exposure," she corrected. I looked down at the stack of journals on my desk, some half-filled, others holding the early drafts of a blog I'd once considered launching. I hadn't written anything in weeks, not because I didn't want to, but because every sentence felt unfinished without closure. "I'm not signing silence," I said. "I didn't think you would," she replied, "but it tells us one thing. They're scared. That's leverage. The next day, Ken emailed Charlotte directly. His tone was suddenly polite, laced with urgency. My wife and I deeply regret the misunderstanding. We are willing to offer a higher payment if Miss West would agree to include a confidentiality clause. This isn't about hiding, it's about healing. Healing, a word people love to use when they're not the ones who've been gutted. Charlotte fired back a concise response that shut it down completely. Later that night, a courier arrived at my apartment with a sealed envelope and 2 cashier's checks inside. One was for the agreed $28,000 restitution and legal expenses. The other was labeled personal contribution, an additional $7,500 and a handwritten note in Iris's perfect penmanship. Fallon, I know you won't believe me, but this was never meant to hurt you. It was supposed to be temporary, just to help us get through. We made mistakes, but I hope this can be a step towards something better. Please don't let this destroy what's left. No signature, no accountability, just I, as if she didn't even trust her name on paper anymore. Jared found me on the couch later, staring at the letter. I didn't realize how tightly I was gripping it until he gently pulled it from my hands. She's still writing like the damage was a shared experience, he said. Like both of you lived through the same fire. No, I said, I built the house. She lit the match. That weekend we met with Charlotte one last time to sign the final binding agreement. Ken and Iris didn't come. Their attorney delivered everything, stiff and courteous. Charlotte reviewed every page, and when she slid the final copy toward me, she looked directly into my eyes. This protects you. They break one condition, anything, you're free to reopen both the civil and criminal case. I signed, slowly, deliberately, not for revenge, for record. Afterward, Jared and I drove up to Coyfield Ridge for the first time since everything began. The cabin was as still as I remembered, but something in the air had changed. Not the scent of pine or the quiet hum of the forest, but the tension that once clung to the walls like moisture. It was gone. Inside, Brandon had left the windows cracked slightly, just enough for fresh air to move through the rooms. The fireplace had been cleaned. The new security system blinked softly in the corner. Every door had been reinforced. The locks were fingerprint-based now. Only 2 prints could open them, mine and Jared's. I changed the code too, Brandon said as we stood in the foyer. Twice, just in case, and I added an auto-lock feature. No one gets in or out without your knowledge. Thank you, I said, for everything. He nodded. I treat this place like my own. When he left, I sat alone on the porch while Jared unpacked. The trees were rustling like they always had, but this time they sounded like permission, like witness. I thought about everything I'd given up to get here. The cabin was never just property, it was proof that I could build something without needing to beg for space, that I could create safety without someone else defining the terms. The next morning, I found a small padded envelope in the cabin's mailbox. No return address. Inside was a USB drive and a note with 5 words. You should see the footage. I plugged it into my laptop with trembling hands. The file was labeled with a date, February 17th, a day I hadn't been there, a day Iris and Ken had been renting the house to someone else. The video was pulled from a still-connected sub-camera I hadn't realized was active. It had been embedded in a motion sensor in the hallway. The footage showed Ken giving a house tour to a couple, but in the background, barely noticeable, was Iris sitting in the living room scrolling through my personal mail. She opened the sealed envelope, read it, smiled, then tucked it into her purse. My jaw locked. It wasn't just money. They'd been intercepting my mail, my private information, possibly bank statements. I emailed Charlotte immediately. She called within 15 minutes. That's a federal crime, she said. We can take this further. But I didn't reply right away. Instead, I sat in the corner of the living room, the sun streaking through the window beside me, and whispered to myself, they really thought I'd stay quiet. The cabin hadn't changed. That was the strange part. After everything, after months of betrayal, courtrooms, sealed envelopes, and phone calls that felt like minor acts of war, it still stood there quiet and steady, as if it had never been violated. But I had changed. The morning after I watched the video of Iris reading my mail, I took a walk along the ridge behind the property. The air was thin and sharp with early frost, and the sound of wind threading through the pines reminded me of the first time I saw this place, back when I still believed isolation meant safety. I didn't tell Charlotte about the footage right away, not because I was protecting anyone, but because For the first time in a long time, I didn't need a courtroom to feel powerful. That afternoon, I sat at the old wooden desk by the living room window and began to write again. Not a blog, not a post, just a letter to myself. I wrote about silence, about how silence in the wrong hands becomes a weapon, about the difference between being private and being erased. I wrote about forgiveness, not as a bridge but as a release. I wrote about how being the quiet one doesn't mean you don't know what's happening, it just means you're choosing when to speak. Halfway through the second page, Jared walked in with the mail. "There's something from your mom," he said gently. I looked at the envelope. No handwriting, just typed text, small and impersonal. It felt like a form letter. I set it aside. Later that night I opened it. Inside was a card with a photo of a gardenia and a single typed sentence. "Sometimes letting go is the only way to hold on." No name, no apology, no mention of Iris. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and for once I didn't feel the urge to fix it. 2 weeks passed, then a month. The money arrived on schedule, all of it. The legal documents were signed and notarized. The court order stood. I was officially uncontactable. By phone, by email, by social media, or in person. I hadn't heard a word since. Charlotte offered to submit the footage to federal investigators just in case. I told her no, not because they didn't deserve it, but because I no longer wanted to keep their shadows stitched into my daily life. Some debts are paid in court, others are paid in distance. One morning I made a choice. I called Brandon and asked him to photograph the cabin in full detail, interior, exterior, views at sunrise and sunset. "Thinking about selling?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. "No," I said after a pause, "not yet." "Just reclaiming it?" I smiled. "Exactly." That afternoon I updated the deed, placed it into a fireproof lockbox. Then I changed the name on the cabin's internal Wi-Fi, something small but deliberate. From Fallen-Guest Net to Boundary Restored. It made me laugh, not bitterly, but in a way that meant I could breathe again. A few days later, Jared and I drove upstate for a weekend retreat, somewhere new, somewhere unmarked by history. On the drive, he asked me if I regretted not pressing charges. "No," I said, "because they'll always remember I could have." When we got home, I opened my old blog editor and clicked New Post. I didn't publish anything yet, but I titled it "When Keeping the Peace Becomes a Prison." Maybe I'd share it. Maybe I wouldn't. But the words were mine, and they weren't written to be approved. They were written to be heard. Some goodbyes aren't spoken out loud. They're made in silence, behind doors that no one has the key to anymore. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that peace isn't something others hand to you. It's something you claim, protect, and sometimes rebuild from scratch. I used to think keeping the peace meant staying silent, but now I know. Boundaries aren't barriers, they're bridges to the life you truly deserve. What would you have done if someone crossed the line, not once, but again and again, just because they thought you wouldn't fight back? If this story touched you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, or even why this resonated with you. And if you'd like to hear more real stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let's keep growing this space together.